Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. I am Beverly Lindsay, the co-director and principal investigator of a multi-year Ford Foundation grant on women and university leadership in conflict, post-conflict, and transitional societies. My co-PI and co-director, we are both equal, is Dr. Yolanda Moses, who is a tenured full professor at the University of California, Riverside. I am a former dean of international programs at both Hampton University and Penn State University. At the beginning, I said greetings for the morning, afternoon, evening, and night. The reason for this is we have participants from several continents, ranging from Australia to Africa, to Asia, to North America, and to South America. So we are having various time zones tuned in to our presentation. Our presentation today is sponsored by the Ford Foundation grant, which is a multi-year grant on women and university leadership in conflict, post-conflict, and transitional societies. This grant began a few years ago. We've had several Zoom presentations, and this one we're doing as a webcast today. We also had a couple of in-person institutes in Riverside, California, with also presentations from Cal State San Bernardino, colleagues from the University of California, Irvine, and University of California, Los Angeles. Both Yolanda and I are very pleased that we were awarded this critical multi-year grant from the Ford Foundation. You are welcome to visit our website, womenleadbeyondconflict.ucr.edu. So we hope you will see that. Another point that I will make at this point is that our work is based largely upon our Ford grant, but we also had National Science Foundation grants, and both of us had Fulbrights during this period. So we are to some extent relying on those three grants, but the views expressed in this presentation today are those by Yolanda Moses and me, Beverly Lindsay. So we now go to the next slide. We begin with a quote by a very eminent South African woman, Naledi Pandor, and she has been the Minister of Education, Minister of Science and Research, and currently she is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for South Africa. And by the way, she completed her PhD in higher education a few years ago. We begin with this quote that states we need to empower women to play their full role in society. And this is so critical to our institute and our webinars. Our next slide provides the overarching purposes of our webinar and articulate 10 key areas. As we view the subsequent slides and presentations by Dr. Moses and by me, we will note that each of these are covered on major slides, and there are certain areas beyond that. We will go back very briefly to the previous slide where those 10 points are presented. So we begin with some surveys of data, our conceptual and policy frameworks, mentors and social capital, different levels for mentorships, skills for leaders and emerging professionals, because this presentation is geared to new and emerging professionals in particular. Later, we will be doing one for people who are more senior, meaning deans, provosts, vice presidents, and presidents. We will also discuss diversity coaches and allies, mid-career and senior professionals, future research and policy needs, and paradigms and prototypes for women university leaders. And we end with 5 A's. We have 5 A's articulated because universities often view grades and evaluations in terms of A's. meaning exemplary. In our next slide, we present some of the surveys and some of the research from the early 2000s until approximately a year ago after the pandemic had begun. And this is the views of proteges, the mentors, and even other people who are very attuned to issues of mentoring. We present this because we think it's important to know what is very current in the field, as well as what people were saying at the dawn of this current century. And some of these areas are highlighted. Each one of them we will not discuss now, but for you to get an overview of what some of the research and practical literature has presented. For example, providing benchmarks for self-assessment. How do you handle stressful situations? The interpretation by mentors of various scenarios. What are the comprehensive pictures that mentors and mentees need? How do you ping off or go back and forth with mentors to have issues addressed? And the next one is very critical, because many times you can have ideas, but there may be resources present or there may be limitations. So that needs to be taken into account. And more recently, certainly throughout the globe, we have had a massive global pandemic, but it's June now. And in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the beginning of hurricane season. So we've already noticed massive floods in some cities. So again, there are pandemics and disasters that are natural, and unfortunately, some that are caused by civil conflicts and coups d'etats or invasions of other countries. But if you're in a university or you have to provide alternatives for people in universities, those are really issues that mentors and mentees need to address, bureaucracies, and finally, enhancing self-confidence. Our next slide we point out that there are a number of caveats that mentors and professionals perceive in terms of higher level of job satisfaction and promote opportunities in higher education, or higher pay, I should say, than those who are not mentored. In other words, there's considerable research that indicates that having strong and solid mentor-mentee relationship has overall positive benefits. Our next slide, and I will briefly mention the first three questions. What if you don't have mentors? How do you identify a mentor? And what are the roles and responsibilities of the organization to provide mentoring options? And Dr. Moses will raise a couple of the questions.
Yes, thank you, Beverly, and I'm happy to be on this presentation. Another issue is, how do individuals realistically take into account demographic characteristics, with higher education becoming more and more diverse and more women moving into positions of leadership in whatever countries you are. This is very, very important to think about your careers around these issues. Also, it's important to understand how organizations account for demographic features and how mentoring in these environments work in both informal and formal mentoring situations on campus. Also, in terms of conceptual framework, we need to be aware of how obstacles are identified and addressed. Sometimes we don't identify them. Sometimes they're not easy to identify, but that's a part of the mentoring process, is to identify what those obstacles are and then to address them in ways that are going to help achieve your goals. And then finally, what overarching generic features help ensure success for individuals, but also for organizations. And we should think about this at two levels. If you're successful as a person who is being mentored, then ultimately your organization is going to be impacted as well.
Those are very good points, Yolanda. And it's certainly important too, depending on what level the person is at. Because one of the aims, of course, for doctoral students and graduate students in general, or whether in law school, medical school, other professional areas beyond the baccalaureate, are to identify how mentoring operates within those entities. So as we move to the next slide, I began work on mentoring, and particularly for some of the material that's on this slide, about 15 or so years ago. In terms of where the term mentor arrived, or derived, I should say. Mentor was a noble in Homer's Odyssey, and he was a counselor and friend to Ulysses. But mentor was also supposed to be entrusted and to care for the son of Ulysses, whose name was Telemachus. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly since I don't speak any ancient languages. So modern writers often note the poor definitional clarity regarding mentorship. But I thought it was so interesting that some of the major literature was discussing this centuries ago. And so what we need to keep in mind is that mentor was originally a noun, the name of a person who was a nobleman in the Odyssey, but now it's as often used for both a noun and a verb. In other words, to mentor. And mentoring is generally someone who's a teacher, an advisor, could be a sponsor, could even be a role model. So as we move to the next slide, I think of an experience I had when I was on a Fulbright in Myanmar. And I had two graduate assistants. One was 22 years of age, and the other was 22 and 24. The 22-year-old told me that she had to respect and listen to the 24-year-old because the 24-year-old was older. I found that comment very interesting and insightful. Why? Because in the United States, a 22 and a 24-year-old graduate student, both working on graduate school degrees, would be regarded as equal. We would call them peer mentors. But what we can see from this, we can ascertain, is that different cultures define and interact in terms of mentors and mentorship on different ways, on different planes. As we move to the next slide, Yolanda has some comments to share.
Yes. I think if there are takeaways from this presentation, and there will be many, three that we want you to keep in mind based on the literature and the research is that, first of all, mentoring has functions. That is, there are outcomes that are expected from good mentoring. One is that these are activities that provide and enhance preparation for your professional growth and development and for leadership roles. And that's a part of what our whole grant was about, is how to move women in higher education from where they are to leadership roles that are going to help with the transformation of their institutions. There are activities also to enhance and promote the psychosocial skills, so that not just the technical skills, but also understanding yourself, who you are, and how to build the kind of self-confidence that you need to take on new roles and to not be hesitant or afraid to take on new roles. And, you know, if you think about the concept of lifelong learning in higher education, think about mentoring as lifelong growth and development. That is, good mentoring relationships are not only preparation for where you want to go with your next job, but it helps you think about your entire career. And so that's what we hope you can get from this presentation, or at least some of the major points. And we'll go to the next slide.
Thank you.
Beverly.
At this slide, we, Yolanda and I, are going to delve briefly into some of the sociological and anthropological literature, namely in terms of social capital. It's an intangible feature that denotes access to privileged information and its resources based upon social relationships. It's interactive, and it often occurs through networks and not mainly through material resources. In other words, it's not something that has an economic value, at least in the immediate sense. As we move to the next slide, and by the way, throughout you can see some of the references that we present. For example, a talented graduate student, instructor, assistant professor, assistant dean could be denied entrance to a select social or an academic club. And in the United States, especially after graduation, a number of very elite private universities and some public universities have academic clubs. And you could still have a degree from that institution rather, but not have access to some of the smaller meetings and all that might occur in the academic clubs on campus or off campus. But the access is social capital. But in the instance of social capital, in both human and economic capital is present, but social capital can be denied when there are actual economic benefits that occur in the more short range. So as we move to slide 12, we continue the discussion on social capital. It encompasses a variety of features, with critical ones including knowing the social structure and the facilitation of certain individual actions to those within the structure. In other words, being able to comprehend the structure and favorably, or to one's favor, be able to use it. For graduate students, some illustrations include continuing teaching or research assistantships, work on prestigious grants and contracts, presentations at national and international conferences. All are unstated criteria for post-university careers and endeavors. This point is really important for graduate students and for new entrance into the field of whatever area you have specialized in. And the reason I say that is because if faculty such as Yolanda and me, we've had various grants from the National Science Foundation for Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Ford Foundation grant. So students who are able to be our graduate or research assistants on these grants have access to this. That puts them prepared for the next level of their continuing graduate study and entrance into their profession. As we move to slide 13, I just actually gave some examples at different levels and for various reasons. There are mentoring relationships that can develop informally. Often this happens between the graduate student and his or her advisee. But many times, and I was discussing this earlier today with someone, you can have mentoring through organizations such as the American Sociological Association, or the, Yolanda can give me the correct name of the Anthropology Association?
Yes, the American Anthropology Association.
Yes. And there is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where Yolanda and I are both mentors. And we have worked for over a decade with graduate students and even undergraduate students who come to some of the national conferences. Usually they're seniors, a few second semester or second term juniors, and they present posters. And that's a way of mentoring them as well. So those are both formal and informal relationships with younger colleagues or emerging graduate students and professionals. We move to slide 14, which is comments by Yolanda.
Yes, and this focuses on skills for leaders and emerging professionals, the kind of skill set you will need to develop, and the kind of mindset that you will need to have. uh, when you're asking for consistent assistance from mentors, they often give you constructive feedback. And this is not just about all the things that you do well, but also failures. It's good to get critical feedback, because at the time you're developing this set of skills as an emerging leader, it's really good to ask the question, what have I learned from this? What have I learned from this failure? How can my mentor help me in a, a guided way? How can this be a learning opportunity for me? So guided learning, mentoring is also about guided learning in a comprehensive fashion. And this includes things like communication, your communication skills. How do you work in teams? And because this is more and more how people in leadership roles solve complex problems, working in team. How adaptable are you? How flexible are you in your work environment? And how can you learn to be more flexible? And how do these things become incorporated into what will become your leadership style, your way of seeing yourself? With more and more women going into leadership roles in higher education, gender is a feature that is now being talked about in all the higher education associations. In the leadership literature, you're finding gender being talked about. And so the idea that it is natural for us as human beings to seek out people who are like us to be mentors. And I think we have to understand that this may be important. In some instances, we can do that. And in some instances, we may not be able to do that. But to the extent that we can, you want to have a good matchup. And as Dr. Lindsay's research shows, for example, African-American women presidents cited their mothers as the person that they saw as their mentor. And she says, this is great, but we do need to move beyond that and add a few more people to our repertoire of who we think about as mentors. Next slide, please. So this means that diversity is important. It's important at a lot of different levels, not only who you see as your personal mentor, but you will have a diversity and a wide variety of mentors over your time period. But it's important for you to understand the involvement of multiple demographic groups, that one size does not fit all. And if you are a mentee or a mentor, getting to know each other culturally is really, really important, because first of all, there has to be building of trust. And that trust leads to friendship. And there has to be a comfort in that relationship where mentors and mentees share some of their life story with each other. I know I am constantly trying to tell my graduate students, but also young professors, we all go through certain stages of our growth and development. And while I've been in higher education for decades, I have gone through the same thing that you're going through. So this is something that helps to establish those bonds. And those bonds are really important because it helps to give mentors and mentees long-range benefits. And I say, I learn just as much from my mentees as they learn from me, because I'm constantly seeing other perspectives. And that's really, really important. Next slide, please. So one skill that you have to cultivate and develop is identifying mentors. How do you identify mentors? And one of the things I remember when I first became a university administrator at a university, and I was a dean, and there was a president of our university who I didn't think was a good person. And he was always the model I used when I thought about the kind of leader I did not want to be like. He provided that opportunity for me to see, no, this is not the way you mentor other people or you lead other people into their successes and failures. So successes and failures then can be learning experiences if the mentor is willing to share both. And I do. I share the things that I'm successful, but I also share the many things that I have not been successful. So if you do that as a mentor, as a mentee, then it will help your mentor. It'll set the stage to build that trust that is really necessary. And now I'll turn it over to Beverly.
Yolanda and I have been discussing the issues of success and not so successful endeavors. And both of us certainly have had options that we sought that were not successful. But on the other hand, we've had many that were. At this time, the National Basketball Association, the NBA, is playing in the finals between the Boston Celtics and the Golden State Warriors, who are in the San Francisco Bay Area. And one of the outstanding players is Steph Curry. He leads the all-time record in three-point shots. Those are the ones that are the farthest distance from the gold. But his success rate is approximately 40%, which means that 60% of his three-point attempts are unsuccessful. Yet the 40% is exceedingly successful, and we can view it in that regard rather than saying he was 60% unsuccessful. So think of your careers, your graduate study, your different options in terms of your successes, and know that there will be a blend of both very successful endeavors and some efforts will not be successful. I've certainly had articles that I submitted that were not published, and I'm sure Yolanda has too. It's not just because of the work we did, it's also the view of whoever the reviewers are, the focus of the journal at that time, what the book publisher wants and is a hot topic. So there are many areas. And I will point out too that one of my mentees when I was very young in my career, starting at Penn State, a very distinguished vice president who often told me and other people, and a very senior ambassador a few years later in my career, you're going to be turned down. You're not always successful, but don't always take it personally and know that you can still succeed. So that brings us into the areas of coaching, because coaching is important for young people or new people in a career, but it's also important for mid-career people, because often we think of coaches in sports, like I just mentioned, the National Basketball Association playoffs are now between Boston and the Celtics in California, the Celtics in Massachusetts, what a Freudian slip, yep. And the Golden State Warriors in California. So they have coaches, but depending on your profession, you can also have mentors who will coach you in specific areas or in specific needs that you have. And they may be and are often external to the organization or to the immediate work environment, because they have normally had experience or know about experience. So keep in mind that there are coaches who can help you move to the next level, from being a department chair if you want to later become an associate dean, or if you had similar experience maybe in a government organization. I must say personally, I have worked in every type of, or been a student in every type of university or college in the United States except for profit. And my first professional position was at a nonprofit organization, namely Goodwill Industries. So how do you transfer from being a counselor in Goodwill Industries to being a doctoral student in social sciences? So those are the kinds of things that coaches can also help you with. As we move to slide 18, we mentioned earlier that there are mentors at different levels and various needs. For example, I just said mentoring for professional can be an attempt to transfer from one experience and expertise from more experienced professional or in another organization. So we move now to 19. Let me remind everybody those 10 areas that we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. At the top of each of the slides, you will see, for example, this one still says skills for professionals. This is one of the areas that we highlighted initially. And here on this slide 19, we discuss the periodic assistance from mentors, and psychological buttressing is often needed. And mentors can handle that or can do that. In the next item under that slide 19, we mentioned a very, very prominent African-American woman. One of the most outstanding women university presidents of the contemporary period is Dr. Ruth Simmons. She completed her undergraduate degree at Dillard University in New Orleans, where I had the chance to meet her when I was the inaugural university fellow and professor in the Office of the President. Dr. Simmons completed her undergraduate degree in literature and then earned her PhD, her doctorate in French literature, doing her work on Césaire. After that, she had a range of professional experiences. She was Associate Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Southern California. Before that, she had been with the University of New Orleans. She became provost at Spelman. She became a vice president at Princeton University, where she worked very closely with Neil Rudenstein, who later became the president of Harvard. Now, in that case, we don't always think of Dr. Simmons as having mentors, and she was a mentee, but in fact, that's what happened. But it also relates to points earlier in our presentation, namely about social capital, because she had a range of experiences in both public and private university with a PhD from one of the world's most outstanding universities. She had the social capital to have a positive and fast trajectory on her administrative career. So after being a vice provost at Princeton, she became the president of she became the president first at Smith College, then Brown University. And while at Brown, she served for over a decade and made a number of phenomenal contributions, including looking at the role of Brown University in the enslavement of people through coming across from the Atlantic to the East Coast of the United States. She decided that after over a decade of experience as the president at Brown University, an Ivy League university, she would retire. She did. She returned to her home state of Texas and was pulled out of retirement to become the president of Prairie View A&M University, one of the most notable historically Black colleges and universities, and HBCU in the United States. And Prairie View is very well known for producing Black engineering graduates. So she was able to use her experiences from the time she was an undergraduate at Dillard University through graduate school, and then the president of an Ivy League university, to bring it back to her home state and contribute to the whole area of Texas, but also domestically and internationally. So there's gender and mentoring, but it's also working with people who are in influential positions, and you are also there, but not quite at the same level. So as we move to slide 20, Yolanda has comments to share.
Yes. This again goes back to gender, but also race and ethnicity in mentoring, how important demographics are. When I started out in my academic career as a faculty member, I had no idea that I even had the skills or inkling to be an academic leader. And it was mentors, primarily white mentors, males and females, who were instrumental in pushing me and showing me how my skills could be used and were needed in universities at that time. And I have had those, and you never know where this is going to come from. The head of the large public system where I was initially a dean, the head of that system was a woman, and she got into trouble because she was a woman and she was taking a strong leadership role on behalf of students and on behalf of diversity issues, and she was being chastised in the press. And I happened to be the head of a women's organization within that system that wrote an op-ed on her behalf and said, this would not be happening if this was a man. And she reached out to me, she remembered that, and she was, from that point on, someone that kept me in mind for leadership positions and leadership roles. And she became the head of a system in New York City. And when there was an opening there, she called and said, you should apply. And I did. And she was my coach. She was my champion for that position. And so at each of the levels where I moved, these were people that you were doing something that was good. You were doing something that was right. And someone noticed it. So don't think that you're alone out there. That is, people are watching you. People who are in leadership roles are looking for good leaders, are looking for people who have potential. And they saw that in me, which I didn't see it in myself. So think about that. And one other example, I wanted to have a presidency here in California, and the head of the system that came after Dr. Reynolds was a man. And he told me, he said, I cannot afford politically to promote you here in California, but any place else you want to go in the United States, I will be happy to be your champion for that. And it also taught me about the politics of higher education, because that's something a mentor can help you with, understanding those things that are beneath the surface that you don't see, so that you don't step into political situations that might get you into hot water. So next slide, please. So part of this is what we've been talking about, are skills to enhance careers and goals of mentees. So we're looking at how to do this work. And we're talking both about people who want to be mentored, but also we're talking to mentees as well. So in this slide, we're looking at skills for mentors to enhance the careers and goals of their mentees. And one of the things we've found in looking at our own experience, but also reading the literature, is that select good or potentially good mentees, so that the surface and the superficial qualities are not the sole or primary considerations. That is, Do you share values with this person? Are you going to be able to learn new knowledge? Are you going to be able to help this person? There may be some people you want to mentor, but you don't have the expertise to do that, and you need to be able to clarify what the expectations are in the relationship so that the mentee does not have unfair expectations of what's going to come out of the relationship. And part of what you're going to be doing as a mentor is help them balance that professional and personal life. You know, we talk about work life as if they're two separate spheres when they aren't. They overlap with each other all the time. And any of you who have a family and are raising children know that's the case. So providing positive affirmation for mentees, but also not being afraid to give that critical feedback is important. But advocacy and professional requirements. I'm working with someone now who says, well, I really don't need to know that. I think I can go for this job. And I say, no, you can't. You are going to have a certain skill set. And it's only if you stop and take on an assistant job or an associate job that will give you that skill set, then you can apply for that higher job, because that's what they're going to ask you. Do you know how to put together budgets? Can you do this kind of work? You can't skip certain steps. And being able to say that to your mentee is really, really important. And I will go to slide 22 and turn it over to Beverly.
Thanks, Yolanda. I'd like to add a few comments to what Yolanda has just voiced over the last few minutes, because expectations are so important. As she pointed out, there may be missing formal or informal qualifications that you're not even aware. And I have been attuned to this, not always initially, because I spent time, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, my first professional position was in a non-government organization, namely Goodwill Industries.
Mm.
But I also spent time working in two different federal agencies. I've worked in historically Black colleges and universities, very top elite public universities, where they're in the top 64 or 65 in the United States and North America, meaning to include Canada, but it did not include Mexican universities. And that association is the Association of American Universities, AAU. And the expectations in each of those universities is very different, because Yale and UCLA and University of California, Berkeley, University of Texas, Austin, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill are public. And even though they're all in this elite organization, AAU, it plays out differently if you're at Yale or Princeton or Harvard. And I've not been a student, but I've made a number of presentations, for example, at Harvard and at Princeton. I cite that example also because 3 of my Fulbrights were in Asian countries, in Indonesia, in South Korea, and in Myanmar. And the cultural nuances are certainly different. Mm-hmm. Whereas, for example, there's a great emphasis on age in both countries or in both areas of the world, meaning between the United States, for example, and Canada, in contrast to those 3 Asian countries that I mentioned. There is real respect for people who are elders and who have been in the career an extensive period of time. Whereas in the United States and Canada, that's respected, but it's always younger and mid-career and what's next. And so that has to be kept in mind, the cultural nuances, and then how you approach mentoring, and mentees. So that becomes very important. But one of the points, regardless of where you are culturally, there need to be allies and supporters who must help you move beyond general skill development and grooming to assume professional or executive positions. Because if you apply for a presidency of, let's say, one of the University of California sites, or at the University of Michigan, or the University of Yangon, the foremost university, for example, Myanmar, there can be 15 people who are qualified and they could all do the job. But as Yolanda mentioned a few minutes ago, there are the political connections, there are what the board is looking for, or the trustees are looking for at a particular time. And most of those 15 people who might be on the semi-short list, and certainly the 3, 4, or 5 who are on a very, very short list as a finalist, they can all do the position. But it may be that call, as Yolanda mentioned a few minutes ago, from somebody who is now, or who knows the New York system, that pushes it over the edge. So those supporters can be deal makers or deal breakers. And I mention this now also because in the United States, a number over the last 5 to 7 years, a number of African Americans have become presidents of AAU universities, at Rutgers, University of California overall system, for example, at Ohio State. 15 years ago, that would not have been possible. And you have to also take into account that even if you're very qualified and have all of the connections, politically and culturally, there are factors within organizations and external that will prevent you from getting particular positions. That doesn't mean you don't try, but keep in mind, however, that after you apply for 3 or 4 and it becomes public knowledge, people view you differently. So there are these different ways that allies and supporters may tell you, as Yolanda stated a few minutes ago, you're not quite ready for this, or the political climate in XYZ country or XYZ city at an urban major university is not willing at this point because the mayor and the university president are at odds with each other. And those are very real. And allies and supporters can help you on that. As we turn to slide 23, I just gave several examples. They're often professionals and they can be students if you're still in graduate school and you're having trouble in your advanced statistics class. They can help you. And they can help you toward mutual goals. But the second red rectangle on this page says that there need to be realistic expectations. Again, a point which Yolanda articulated a few minutes ago. What is the organizational culture? What's the political climate? What's the landscape? And this one is the next ones that I really emphasized when I taught administration and higher education on my Fulbrights and at Penn State, and did workshops at other places like at Dillard University and the University of Georgia. How many political chips can be used by the sponsor? In other words, that person, as Yolanda said a few minutes ago, may have already used up 10 political chips in a state and they can't use anymore. Or even if they haven't used up their political chips in a situation, they know something that you don't know. And it's not a wise time to advise you to do something in terms of trying to move forward. But equally important is how many are they willing to use? Because if they're not willing to help you, they're really not going to be able to assist you, at least not at that period in time. And what value does the mentee or the protege bring to the situation? Because we don't want to view things as quid quo, but at the same time, that is often what can happen after a long mentoring relationship. So as we move to slide 24, there will be obstacles. And as I said a few minutes ago, and you may have the credentials, but what are the other obstacles that are seen and unseen? What are the unpublished criteria? And that's what is often so important as you try to move to the next level. In the United States, and in fact, I'm writing a piece now for the Comparative and International Education Society on global equity. And it's in vogue now to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion. But that plays out differently in different universities in different countries and even in the same country. So, how are these demographic variables at play at a particular time? So, the bottom line is to know and try to comprehend the terrain in which you are involved. And that would often come from the mentor to the mentee, or the coach to the player. As we move to slide 25, future research and policy issues. Most of us who will be listening and presenting in this webinar are involved or have been involved extensively in post-secondary education, colleges, and universities. But we also engage in research, that the future research and policy studies need to be examined and continually about mentoring relationships. And they should include different types of colleges, different types of universities, different types of mentoring, and the different frameworks that Yolanda and I presented a bit earlier, such as social capital, economic capital, and how do they play out in different settings. So this research and policy needs are important. And I emphasize policy needs because you can have the best research in the world, but if it doesn't translate into policies to help people move forward, in some ways you may as well not do it, because there's plenty of research on mentoring that goes back, as I cited at the beginning, to citing how the term mentor came about as presented in the Odyssey. We move to slide 26. And yeah, this is something that I will also ask Yolanda to briefly comment on, and that's because she is familiar with the NASEM study.
Correct. I've been involved with STEM education for about 20 years and been involved with the National Science Foundation on undergraduate, graduate, and leadership roles in the fields of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. The National Academies for Science, Engineering, and Medicine here in the United States have become so concerned about creating the next generation of diverse professionals and leaders in these fields that they put together a study where they brought together all their thinkers around this issue from the various academies, and they publish the Science of Effective Mentorship, and it's in your references, and it's online, and it's free, and it's downloadable, so you can get copies of it if you would like. And these are the things that they're recommending for policy, for research and policy. And in the sciences, to Dr. Lindsay's point, if it can't be translated into usable kind of information, then it's only words on paper. And what we want to do is to look at this whole field of leadership, not in a haphazard way where you fall into a leadership role or you just happen to be in the right place at the right time. No, this is about how to create the conditions on the ground for successful leadership roles. And mentoring comes out number one at the top of the list. So what they're suggesting is that we conduct more multidisciplinary research. Prior to National Science Foundation getting involved with the National Academy of Science, the assumption was that all of the answers to the questions were in the fields of science. What scientists are starting to recognize is that if they're not familiar with the social science and the humanities, then they're not going to move that needle, because this is about human behavior. And that's not something that they're steeped in. So the partnerships with social scientists like me have become more and more a way that research is being funded. And for those of you who are looking for funding opportunities, this might be a way to do that. We need to understand more how differing conditions and contexts of mentorship vary differently, may affect differently individuals with diverse sociocultural identities. That is, one size does not fit all. All experiences are not the same. If you're going to be an effective mentor, then you need to know who your mentee is, and the mentee needs to understand who their mentors are. Identity matters, and scientists are saying this. They also suggest that we make greater use of study designs that allow for both causal and longitudinal inferences. So we can track how these kinds of changes happen, under what conditions do they happen, to turn the scientific lens on the field of mentoring, if you will. The next slide, please. Also, mentoring and coaching for positive change for diverse groups of people. Again, one size does not fit all. We have to be intentional about understanding the intersections. And that's a term that is being used a lot in research these days. The idea of intersecting identities and looking at the issue from all of those intersections that a person may have. Resistance to change, that is, yes, we talk about change, but institutions are designed to perpetuate themselves and to stay the way they are. They're designed for stasis. And what future research is suggesting is that we need to be able to move the needle. As an individual, you can only do so much. How do you do institutional change? So it isn't just your role as the champion of a project or the champion of something to make change happen. How do you push institutional change? That is something. And what are the conditions? And this speaks to an issue that we've been talking about throughout this whole presentation. And that is, what are factors other than mentoring that are affecting career development and goals? What are the unstated issues that are out there that need to be made visible? What are the invisible challenges that may be just underneath the surface or nobody wants to talk about that needs to be made visible so that we can tackle them? If they're not visible, we can't do anything about it. If we don't name it, we can't do anything about it. If we don't create specific policies to deal with that specific issue, then we can't do anything about it. So we have to understand structural issues, cultural issues, which are deeply embedded in American society, and I'm sure in the societies in which you are all involved, as well as political issues. And for a science foundation to come to this conclusion means that they actually have been talking to social scientists and humanists to come up with these questions. So I'll turn it back to you, Beverly.
As we move to slide 28, this is a diagram that was presented at one of our institutes at the University of California in Riverside with input from Irvine, UCLA, and Cal State San Bernardino, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation. A considerable amount of it was based upon some research that I have been doing for literally much of my professional career. Because as a professor of higher education and international policy studies at several universities in the United States and my Fulbrights in African and Asian universities, I focus often on women university leaders. And so the overall objective, which Yolanda and I have just been discussing from the previous slide, is policies to increase the underrepresentation. That's the overall goal. But at the top, I put the challenges is to increase women in university leadership. That was a focus of our Ford Foundation grant, of work that Yolanda has done through the National Science Foundation, that I've done through Fulbright's, that I've done with my co-PI role with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But we began, if you look at the right side of the screen, what are the conceptual frameworks to address some of the barriers? Now, in this presentation, we briefly discussed some of the key questions and presented conceptual frameworks. Obviously, conceptual frameworks will vary depending on what you're studying. Next, we move to data collection. There has to be sound data collection that meets rigorous social science and scientific criteria. So that is critical. Data analysis. There are numerous courses at the undergraduate level, but especially in graduate school on how do you analyze the data, whether it's qualitative, mixed methods, etc. And then, and notice that all of these lines are still pointing to ways to address the objective. Then there is an evaluation, whether formative, meaning the evaluation is still going on, or summative, which normally occurs at the end. And summative evaluations can in the future be formative evaluations to provide future research. And then the goal of all of this is to remove some of the barriers so that the challenges become less. And this may occur over decades. We would hope it doesn't take, let's say, 35 years for something to happen, 3.5 decades, but unfortunately, it really does. Yolanda and I are baby boomers. So we've been in our professions for well over 30 to 40 years. And we can compare what was happening in the 1980s and 90s compared to now. So for example, in the 1980s, it was very rare to see any women university presidents of major universities in the United States. That was just a reality. We see more now. If we go to other countries, for example, we began with the quote by Nellie Pandor. When she first started becoming active through the ANC, the African National Council in South Africa, there were not women in certain key leadership positions. But as time passed and the work of people from years ago helped to build and move people forward. So this is putting this prototype for fostering women university leaders. And it's a step in helping post-conflict and transitional societies move forward in the preparation of highly skilled leaders and professionals. And the circumstances can certainly differ in each country. When I was in Mozambique and we had participants from Mozambique in our Ford Foundation Institute, they had reached about a decade earlier a peace accord between the two major political parties, and there was civil war in Mozambique. But also, there were massive floods caused by tsunamis. So the issue of both man-made or human-made conflicts and natural disasters had to both be addressed. So what are the issues that play out? When I had a Fulbright in Indonesia, for example, many Asian universities are trying to have their credentials, their quality of research, their quality of teaching recognized more broadly, not just within their countries. They would like it recognized in Australia, in Japan, in Canada, in Germany. So we were looking at accreditation issues and how do you try to meet local needs, which is part of public engagement, but also some of the international needs that will ultimately lead to professional opportunities and enhancement for women, but also the larger society. So how we do this prototype will differ depending on the country, but it's going to be based on sound research and data. As we move to slide 29, which in some ways is a further goal, I began by saying that we had 10 objectives And the last one was the 5 A's. A's because we are in the academy where A's in most Western countries, many other countries as well, developing and emerging nations, also use A's. Begin with knowing an awareness, having an awareness and acknowledging what the goals or issues are. What are the challenges? Then accepting it, analysis, which was similar to the slide we just saw, and then taking action. You can't just keep saying, okay, we have a problem, but what do we do in terms of action? And then assessment, and then it would go back to whatever the next steps are. And this is some original research I actually published in 2006 when we had a Centers for Disease Control and Prevention grant. And I was the co-PI dealing with some of the issues on HIV/AIDS in Africa and in select Asian countries. So the model can be used in a variety of settings. And in this case, we're talking about how do we use this 5 A's to help prepare women to be in more creative and solid leadership positions and creating positive changes for both individuals and for the organization and the larger society. And if we move, I think, to the last slides, which are our references. Yolanda and I did not go into detail on all of the references, but you can certainly see them. Both of us, Yolanda and I, encourage you to view our website, be back in touch with us, offer comments. If you end up doing short recordings, we can also put them later because this is a webinar and we know that people are on different time zones. For example, our colleague in Australia, who is in Queensland, it's the middle of the night. They're about 12 hours ahead of us, and it is on the East Coast about 6:45. So it's actually early morning, I should say, in Australia.
Yeah.
And in Myanmar, where I was, they're about 12 hours, I think, at this time ahead of us. And of course, if they're in South America, where we had participants, they could be on the same time zone as those of us on the East Coast, if they're in Brazil or Colombia, are only an hour or two difference. So you may be viewing this within a few days, or it might even be a couple of weeks or a month, but feel very free to be back in touch with us with any written comments. We're going to do 2 more of these, dealing with different aspects, and Yolanda, as a former university president, and one of her colleagues from a California private university who is a woman president, will also be presenting, and then we'll have a 3rd one later. But we thank you for joining us today and look forward. And as Dr. Naledi Pandor states, by interacting with people in multiple environments, multiple continents, multiple countries, we can all move forward collectively with benefits for everyone. Thank you very much.